Welcome to the deep dive. So you know that story we always hear, the one about the history of ideas, philosophy, basically knowledge itself.
Yeah, the one that goes like ancient Greece, then straight through Europe, and well, that's kind of it.
Exactly that one. It's neat, it's kitey.
Yeah.
But the sources we've been looking at for this deep dive suggest maybe that story's missing
Yeah.
quite a lot.
Oh, absolutely. Fascinating detours, influences we don't talk about, maybe whole continents of thought just sort of sidelined.
And that's what we're getting into today. We're unpacking sources that really question that standard history,
Mm-hmm.
challenging some of the big names, the fathers of thought,
Mm-hmm.
uncovering movements that got pushed aside, and looking at how biases, cultural biases, have really shaped what we even call knowledge.
So the big question we're tackling is the history of philosophy just too Eurocentric?
That's the one. And what does that really mean for us, for how we understand everything?
Well, based on these sources, the answer seems pretty clear. Yes, overwhelmingly so. I mean, you look at the standard list, the philosophical canon: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle,
Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, Hume, Kant.
Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Sartre. It's almost exclusively European thinkers, white European men, mostly.
And when you list them like that, it's kind of jarring, isn't it? You suddenly realize the scale of what's not being mentioned.
Precisely. We're talking vast, deep philosophical traditions that are often just ignored or maybe relegated to a footnote.
Like where? What are some examples?
Okay, think about Asia. Indian philosophy, Vedanta, Buddhism, Nyaya, Jainism, huge, complex systems. Then Chinese philosophy, Confucianism, Taoism, Mohism, legalism.
Right.
Japanese philosophy, Zen, the Kyoto School. And, critically important, the Persian, Arabic, and Islamic philosophical traditions: Avicenna, Averroes, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Mullah Sadra. These were absolute giants.
Giants who often don't even make the index in standard Western philosophy books.
Exactly. And it's not just Asia. Africa, too. Ancient Egyptian thought, its potential influence. Ethiopian philosophy, like Zer Yacob, who's fascinating.
Ubuntu ethics.
African sage philosophy, the rich intellectual life in pre-colonial societies. And the indigenous Americas. Sophisticated ethics, metaphysics, ways of knowing, largely erased or dismissed.
But why? How did this happen? It feels too big to be just an accident, like everyone collectively forgot.
No, it wasn't accidental. The sources point to a few key factors. Colonialism is a big one. European expansion happened alongside the development of modern universities.
Okay.
And non-European thought was often labeled primitive, mythical, not real philosophy. That label stuck, and it got baked into the institutions.
So it's partly about defining philosophy itself in a very specific way.
Exactly. A definitional bias. If philosophy means written, systematic treatises in a particular Western argumentative style.
Then oral traditions, poetry, legal codes, even if they contain deep wisdom, they just don't count.
They often didn't. Plus, language barriers were huge. Untranslated texts, or texts translated and interpreted through a very Eurocentric lens, distorting the original meaning.
And then there's the whole Greek miracle idea, right? That philosophy just sort of popped into existence in Greece, fully formed.
Yeah, that narrative tends to downplay influences on Greece from Egypt or Mesopotamia, perhaps, and it definitely ignores parallel developments happening elsewhere. And finally, the institutions themselves, universities, journals, were founded by Europeans, naturally promoting their own heritage.
What are the consequences then, if this history is so skewed?
Well, intellectual poverty, for one. We're missing out on huge swaths of human wisdom. It distorts our actual history, giving this false picture of European exceptionalism.
It marginalizes other cultures.
Absolutely. And in a globalized world, it limits philosophy's relevance, its ability to speak to diverse peoples and tackle global problems effectively. It's a profound limitation.
This sounds like exactly the kind of critique that ethnic studies engages with. How does that field connect to this problem of Eurocentrism in philosophy?
Ethnic studies is, a direct challenge to this. Its whole purpose is to question the idea that European perspectives are universal by focusing on the histories and ideas of racialized, colonized peoples.
African Americans, Chicans, Latins, Asian Americans, indigenous peoples.
Right. It makes visible what Eurocentrism rendered invisible. It shows that the universal story was actually very particular, very selective.
So it's not just about adding diverse voices, it's about questioning the very foundation of how knowledge is defined and validated.
That's absolutely key. Ethnic studies critiques epistemology, how we know what we know. Thinkers like Gayatri Spivak talk about epistemic violence,
The dreams.
the systematic silencing or devaluing of non-Western ways of knowing. Oral traditions, embodied knowledge, community wisdom dismissed as not rigorous by Western standards. Ethnic studies validates these alternative epistemologies.
And it connects us back to power, doesn't it? Like how Eurocentrism served colonialism.
Definitely. It analyzes how Eurocentrism wasn't just an academic bias, but a tool of power. Edward Said's work on Orientalism is a classic example how the West constructed the Orient as inferior to justify ruling it. Ethnic studies shows how these power structures are reproduced, even today, within universities.
Are there specific concepts or theories from ethnic studies that are really central here?
Sure, you have things like critical race theory, looking at how racism is embedded in systems, or decolonial theory from thinkers like Quijano and Mignolo, who argue we need to decolonize not just politics, but knowledge itself, breaking free from those colonial patterns of thought.
It sounds like it goes beyond just critique, though. Does it offer alternative ways of doing scholarship?
Yes, very much so. It pushes for decolonial methodologies, interdisciplinarity, breaking down those rigid academic silos. And often there's a strong emphasis on community engagement, making scholarship accountable to the people it's about, rather than just being an abstract academic exercise. It's about building a more truthful, more inclusive understanding.
Okay, let's loop back to ancient Greece then. If we're challenging Eurocentrism, what about Greek philosophy's influence outside Europe? We hear so much about its impact on Europe. Was it felt just as strongly elsewhere?
That's a great question, and the answer is complex. Greek philosophy definitely had a significant impact in certain places outside Europe, but it wasn't this uniform wave washing over the globe. Its reach was selective, and it was often transformed by the cultures it encountered.
So where did it have the most significant impact outside Europe?
Without question, the Islamic world. This is the crucial link. During Islam's golden age, roughly 8th to 12th centuries, there was this incredible movement centered in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, to translate Greek philosophy and science into Arabic.
They weren't just translating, though, were they?
No, not at all. Figures like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, or Ibn Sina and Averroes ibn Rushd, they weren't just passive recipients. They deeply engaged with Aristotle, Plato, Neoplatonism. They critique them, synthesize them with Islamic theology, with Persian ideas, even Indian thought. They built upon it.
And this Arabic tradition then fed back into Europe.
Hugely important. Many Greek texts were actually lost to Western Europe during the early Middle Ages. They survived because they'd been translated into Arabic. Then, in the 12th and 13th centuries, these Arabic versions, along with the brilliant commentaries by Muslim philosophers, were translated into Latin, mainly in Spain and Sicily. That transmission was a massive catalyst for the European Renaissance and scholasticism.
So Europe rediscovered much of its Greek heritage through the Islamic world.
In large part, yes. It's a history of connection, not isolation. Jewish philosophers living within the Islamic world, like the great Maimonides, also played a key role, integrating Aristotle again, often via Arabic sources with Jewish thought.
What about further east? South Asia, East Asia?
But much less direct impact. In South Asia, you had some Greco-Bactrian kingdoms after Alexander, some artistic exchange, maybe some science. But the core Indian philosophical traditions developed largely independently. In East Asia, there was very little direct contact until much later, like Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century. But even then, Chinese philosophy had its own robust traditions, and Greek thought didn't make huge inroads.
In sub-Saharan Africa, before colonialism.
Influence was mostly confined to the Mediterranean coast, like Alexandria, which was a major Hellenistic center, and thinkers like Plotinus, Augustine. They were North Africans steeped in Greek thought. But there's little evidence it spread deeply south before the colonial period.
So a profound impact, especially via the Islamic world acting as a bridge, but not the universal foundation narrative we sometimes get.
Exactly. It puts Greek influence in a more global, interconnected context.
Speaking of giants, Karl Marx called Aristotle the father of modern philosophy. That's a pretty big claim. How does that hold up today?
It's a statement that definitely reflects a common 19th century view, but yeah, modern scholarship sees it as much more complicated. Aristotle's influence is absolutely immense, undeniable. But father of modern philosophy, that's probably an oversimplification.
Why is his influence so massive, though? What did he establish?
Well, his work on logic, the organon, basically created the toolkit for systematic reasoning used for centuries. His concepts in metaphysics, ethics, politics, biology, they shaped the entire intellectual landscape of the medieval world, both Islamic and Christian. Aquinas integrated him into Catholic theology. So, yeah, a giant.
But you're saying not the direct father of modern thought. Why the hesitation?
Because modern philosophy, starting really with Descartes around the 17th century, consciously defined itself by breaking away from Aristotle and the scholastic tradition built on him. Thinkers like Bacon, Descartes, Hobbes, they rejected Aristotelian ideas like final causes, teleology.
Purpose-driven explanations for nature.
Right. They embraced mechanistic explanations, seeing the universe more like a machine. They emphasized individual reason and empirical observation over reliance on ancient authorities like Aristotle.
And as we just discussed, Aristotle came back to Europe through those Islamic and Jewish thinkers, layered with their interpretations.
Exactly. It wasn't a pure, direct inheritance. Plus, modern philosophy drew heavily on other ancient streams, too. The revival of skepticism was huge for Descartes' method of doubt. Stoicism, Epicureanism, Platonism were also important counterweights.
And the scientific revolution must have played a role. Copernicus, Galileo.
A massive role. Their discoveries fundamentally challenged the Aristotelian picture of the cosmos and physics. You needed new philosophy to make sense of this new science, philosophy Aristotle couldn't provide.
So modern scholars see him as foundational for pre-modern thought. But modern philosophy emerged more in dialogue, even opposition to him.
Precisely. He's a cornerstone, absolutely essential for understanding what came before. But modern philosophy is born from a complex, often critical engagement with his legacy, alongside many other influences. Descartes is probably a better candidate for father of modern philosophy because of that radical break.
That clarifies things a lot.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier the term Dark Ages is misleading. What about the Celts during that period? Did they have their own philosophical contributions separate from Rome that maybe got underestimated?
Oh, definitely. Dark Ages is such a loaded, inaccurate term. It completely ignores vibrant intellectual life happening outside the former Roman core, especially in Ireland. Roman writers often dismissed Celts as barbarians, but that ignored really sophisticated traditions.
Like what? What kind of distinct Celtic thought existed?
Well, pre-Christian Druidic traditions had a deep focus on nature, cyclical time, interconnectedness, a different cosmology. Then you have Brehon law in Ireland, flourishing around the 7th to 9th centuries. It was an incredibly complex legal system, emphasizing restorative justice, community harmony, using poetic language, really distinct from Roman law.
How did Christianity interact with that? Did it wipe it out?
Interestingly, in Ireland, you see more of a syncretism, a blending. Early Irish monks often integrated Christian ideas with native Celtic sensibilities. A key figure is John Scotus Erigena in the 9th century.
Erigena, what did he do?
He wrote this amazing work, Paraphysion, blending Neoplatonism, Christian theology, and possibly Celtic ideas about nature's divinity. He argued God is fundamentally present in creation, not just separate from it. Some see him anticipating modern ideas like process theology. There's also philosophical poetry, wisdom texts.
So Ireland wasn't intellectually dark at all then?
Quite the opposite. While continental Europe was fragmented, Irish monasteries like Clonmacnoise were major centers of learning. They preserved not just Christian texts, but also classical knowledge, like bits of Aristotle, which Irish monks then helped reintroduce to mainland Europe, contributing to the Carolingian Renaissance. Erigena himself was a highly sophisticated thinker, using reason and dialectics centuries before famous scholastics like Anselm.
Why did this get underestimated for so long?
Several things. Celtic thought was often in oral traditions, law, poetry, not the systematic treatises valued by later Greco-Roman influence scholarship, so definitional bias again.
Right.
Christianization preserved some things, but obviously reframed them. Sources are scarce before the 7th century. And later nationalist movements sometimes romanticized the Celts, which led to a backlash where even legitimate claims were dismissed.
But scholars are revisiting this now.
Yes, absolutely. The sophistication of Brehon law is increasingly recognized. Erigena is being rediscovered as a major medieval thinker, and comparative philosophy is looking at Celtic traditions alongside others as valuable alternatives to purely rationalist models.
This really builds on the idea that the shift towards empirical science, that epistemological turn, wasn't just about Galileo. It sounds like a much slower, more complex process.
Exactly. Galileo is the famous flashpoint, the dramatic confrontation. But the groundwork was laid over centuries by many different forces. He was building on something already in motion.
What were some of those earlier forces pushing towards observation and reason, even within seemingly religious contexts?
Well, even medieval scholasticism, by using Aristotelian logic to understand faith, sharpened the tools of reason. Thinkers like Aquinas made rational arguments central, which perhaps unintentionally opened the die for rational challenge later on. You also had figures like Erigena emphasizing reason and nature as paths to God. Mystics prioritizing personal experience over dogma. These currents existed within Christianity itself.
And we already talked about the huge contribution from the Islamic world.
Absolutely crucial. Avicenna, Averroes, their fusion of Greek logic with empirical observation in medicine, optics, astronomy that provided practical methods and knowledge that flowed into Europe and were used by figures like Galileo. Averroes' idea of double truth, that faith and reason could operate independently, also subtly challenged monolithic religious authority over knowledge.
So those dark ages were actually quite active intellectually.
In many ways, yes. Monasteries weren't just for prayer. They were centers of innovation in agriculture, technology, medicine preservation. Charlemagne's earlier Renaissance tried to revive classical learning. The foundations for empirical study were being laid piece by piece.
Were there other, maybe less obvious contributors?
Yes, I think so. You have the accumulated practical knowledge outside academia, farmers, sailors, artisans developing skills through observation and trial and error. You have social changes like the rise of cities and trade demanding practical solutions, the printing press spreading ideas far faster, and colonial encounters unsettling European assumptions by revealing vastly different cultures and knowledge systems.
So Galileo's genius was maybe in synthesis and provocation, standing on the shoulders of this long, diverse history.
I think that's a fair way to put it. He masterfully used the tools available, math, the telescope, logic, to make a powerful case for heliocentrism, challenging authority directly. But those tools and much of the data came from centuries of work by others, including many outside Europe.
Why is it important to see it this way, as a complex evolution rather than a single revolution?
Well, it challenges that simplistic science versus religion narrative. Often, the pioneers saw science as exploring God's creation. The conflict was more between inquiry and dogmatism. And it really undermines the idea of Western exceptionalism. The scientific revolution wasn't just a European miracle. It had global roots and influences. It's a richer, more accurate story.
That's a really important shift in perspective. Moving to another field, anthropology. I was struck by something in the sources. Early anthropologists like Fraser or Morgan, even Mead later, seemed to aim for objective observation, maybe less intrusive than missionaries. But the field itself still feels like, as one source put it, fertile ground for elitist assumptions. That feels like a paradox. What's going on there?
That's a really sharp observation, and it gets right to the heart of a long-standing tension in anthropology. You're right, the stated aim was after scientific objectivity, understanding cultures, not changing them like missionaries.
What was that objectivity real?
Often, it was more of an illusion, or at least deeply flawed. Even armchair anthropologists like Fraser, working from texts, impose their own Eurocentric evolutionary frameworks, ranking cultures from savage to civilized. Field workers like Malinowski or Mead, while gathering rich data, still interpreted it through Western theories, and their own biases inevitably shaped what they thought and reported. Even respectful work, like Diane Bell's Daughters of the Dreaming, centering Aboriginal women, still operated within that power dynamic of the Western academic explaining the other.
So where does the elitism come in if the intent was often understanding?
It's deeply rooted in the discipline's origins. Anthropology grew up alongside colonialism. Often, its practical purpose was to help colonial administrators understand and manage subject populations. This immediately set up a power imbalance. The Western scholar is the expert, the knower, studying the non-Western subject. There was also the salvage anthropology idea, this notion that indigenous cultures were disappearing and needed to be documented by Western experts before they vanished. It positions the anthropologist as the preserver, the authority. I think so. Missionaries aimed for radical transformation, changing beliefs, customs, identities. Their intrusion was overt. Anthropologists' intrusion was often more subtle, but still profound. It was extractive, taking knowledge. It was classificatory, imposing external labels. And it was epistemic, controlling how that culture was understood in the wider world. Both had deep impacts, just different kinds.
Has anthropology grappled with this legacy?
Oh, absolutely. Intensely. Since the 1960s and 70s, there's been huge self-critique, post-colonial theory, feminist critiques, the writing culture movement. There's much more focus now on reflexivity, anthropologists acknowledging their own biases and position, and on collaborative research, working with communities, trying to decenter that Western authority. The struggle continues, but the awareness of that historical elitism is central to the discipline today.
That makes sense. And thinking about that complexity, intent versus impact, the subtle ways power works, it actually reminds me a bit of Machiavelli. He's often seen as this purely cynical figure.
Right, the Machiavellian stereotype.
But the sources suggest his reputation might be worse than deserved, that his pragmatism was aimed at something bigger, maybe even a kind of proto-Italian nationalism.
You've drawn a really insightful parallel there. Yes, Machiavelli's popular reputation is often a caricature. His pragmatism was absolutely rooted in a specific, desperate context and aimed at a larger political goal: the unification and liberation of Italy.
So what was driving him? What was the goal behind the prince?
Italy, in his time, was fragmented, weak, constantly invaded by France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire. Machiavelli was a diplomat and patriot who felt this humiliation deeply. His goal wasn't just abstract power politics. It was about creating a state strong enough to throw out the barbarians, as he called them, and achieve stability. The closing chapter of The Prince is a passionate plea for Italian redemption.
And the ruthless advice, fear over love, deception, cruelty, was that meant as a general guide to life?
Not at all. That's the core misunderstanding. That advice was for rulers in times of extreme crisis, especially when founding new states or trying to restore order amidst chaos. In his other major work, The Discourses on Livy, he praises republican virtues for stable societies. He was pragmatic about means to achieve a specific end-state survival. He was scandalous because he described how power really operated, separating it from morality, which horrified many.
So his reputation suffered because people took quotes out of context and ignored his ultimate goal.
Largely, yes. Plus, the church banned his book. Political enemies used his name as an insult. He became a symbol for amoral political maneuvering, even though his analysis was arguably more realistic than prescriptive for all situations.
The sources link into Gramsci's idea of the modern prince. How did Gramsci, a 20th century Marxist, connect with Machiavelli?
It's a brilliant reinterpretation. Gramsci, writing in a fascist prison, saw Machiavelli's prince not as an individual ruler, but as a metaphor for the revolutionary political party, the Communist Party in his case. This collective prince needed Machiavellian realism, strategic thinking, and cultural leadership, what Gramsci called hegemony, and the war of position, to unite the working class and overthrow capitalism. He saw Machiavelli's insights into acquiring and maintaining power as essential for modern revolutionary struggle.
That's fascinating. You can almost see echoes in other revolutionary figures, maybe like Irish nationalists Wolfe Tone or Robert Emmet.
That's a very apt comparison. Tone, a Protestant leading Catholic rebels allied with revolutionary France, a pragmatic move aimed purely at national liberation, cutting across old divides. Emmet's doomed uprising and his famous speech embracing martyrdom for a future cause that resonates with Machiavelli's understanding of symbolic action and the long game of political change. They shared that blend of idealism, a free Ireland, and hard-nosed tactical thinking.
It seems like there's a recurring type here, the pragmatic idealist. Someone focused on achieving a goal, even if it requires difficult choices.
I think so. These figures understand that power isn't just about force, but also about culture, ideas, collective will. They focus on human agency, what people can do, rather than just waiting for fate or divine intervention. And they often recognize, like Machiavelli did, that innovators make enemies, that their ideas might take time to bear fruit, perhaps even after they're gone. They plant seeds.
This idea of pragmatism seems relevant to the Enlightenment, too. We often think of it as purely about reason and ideals, but was there a strong practical, maybe even Machiavellian streak running through it?
You've hit on something really crucial. The Enlightenment, while championing reason, was incredibly focused on practical application. The philosophers weren't just abstract thinkers, they were reformers deeply invested in improving society, governance, human life in tangible ways. Pragmatism was arguably the driving force.
How did that play out? In what ways was it pragmatic?
Look at Diderot's encyclopedia. It wasn't just philosophy. It was a massive compilation of practical knowledge, crafts, science, technology aimed at empowering people and driving progress. Bacon's "knowledge is power" is the ultimate pragmatic slogan. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations aimed to provide a practical framework for economic prosperity.
And in politics, too, not just grand theories.
Right. Voltaire supported enlightened despots because he pragmatically thought they could implement reforms efficiently. Montesquieu's separation of powers was a practical design to prevent tyranny. Beccaria argued against torture based on its ineffectiveness as a deterrent, a practical argument for legal reform.
Even in religion. How could religion be pragmatic?
Locke argued for religious toleration partly on pragmatic grounds. Persecution causes social unrest and hurts trade. Tolerance is good for stability and the economy. Deism was presented as a reasonable religion, stripping away divisive dogma to promote social harmony based on shared ethics.
But this pragmatism had its downsides, didn't it? Compromises with power, justifying questionable actions for the greater good.
Absolutely. There's a definite dark side. Philosophers courted powerful monarchs who weren't always enlightened. Enlightenment ideas were sometimes used to justify colonialism or exploitation. Locke himself invested in the slave trade. The pursuit of progress and order sometimes involved morally troubling compromises, a kind of realpolitik echoing Machiavelli's focus on necessita, acting out of necessity.
It's fascinating how this tension, the push for progress, the awareness of its costs, the blends of idealism and realism, coincides with the Industrial Revolution and the explosion of great poetry. Burns, Shelley, Blake. They seem to capture this exact moment.
You've nailed it. That period, late Enlightenment into Romanticism, was this incredible pressure cooker. You have breathtaking technological leaps, steam power, factories generating immense optimism about mastering nature, ending scarcity. But at the same time, deep anxiety about pollution, exploitation, the destruction of old ways of life.
And the poets weren't just celebrating the progress or lamenting the loss. They were doing both, often in the same breath.
Exactly. They weren't naive boosters or simple Luddites. Burns celebrates human dignity. A man's banned for ate that, but also shows the harsh reality of rural poverty to a mouse. Shelley is this soaring utopian visionary, Prometheus unbound, but also deeply engaged with political struggle and scientific discovery, Ode to the West Wind. Blake sees divine glory everywhere, auguries of innocence, but rages against the dark, satanic mills and child labor, London, Jerusalem.
So they held these contradictory truths together, the potential and the peril.
Precisely. They refused easy answers. They saw the immense power being unleashed by reason and technology, but they also insisted on asking, power for what? At what human cost? Blake's mind-forged manacles, Shelley's warnings about unchecked power, Burns's focus on the human heart. They remind us that progress isn't purely technical, it's deeply moral and social. Their genius lies in capturing that fundamental ambiguity of modernity, which still resonates today.
Circling back one last time to hidden influences. We've talked about Eurocentrism, overlooked traditions. One particularly interesting niche mentioned in the sources is Scottish Gaelic philosophy. How might this often ignored Gaelic culture have subtly influenced major Scottish Enlightenment thinkers?
This is a really fascinating area, challenging the standard narratives again.
Right.
While you won't find formal Gaelic philosophical treatises in the same way, the cultural environment, the Gaelic language, oral traditions, clan structures, ways of understanding community and place definitely seems to have seeped into the thinking of figures like Reid, Ferguson, even Adam Smith. The Scottish Enlightenment didn't happen in a purely Anglophone abstract space.
Can you give some examples? How might Reid's common sense philosophy connect?
Reid's strong rejection of Hume's deep skepticism, his insistence on the reliability of common human intuition and perception that resonates strongly with the grounded empirical worldview often found in Gaelic proverbs and oral tradition. He grew up bordering the Gaelic-steeping Highlands. Adam Ferguson, who wrote about the development of civil society.
Yes.
He came from Gaelic Perthshire. His analysis of social bonds, mutual obligations, and the dangers of commercial society eroding community spirit seems implicitly informed by the dynamics of Highland clan structures and the concept of dúchas, that deep inherited connection to land and people.
And Adam Smith, father of capitalism. Surely he wasn't influenced by Gaelic thought.
It sounds counterintuitive, but there are arguments. His theory of moral sentiments, focusing on empathy as the basis of morality, aligns well with Gaelic ethics emphasizing kinship, cairdias, and mutual support, cuidichad. His view of the market operating within a framework of social sympathy might reflect Gaelic ideals of cordad, or social harmony. It's subtle, but suggests his economic thought wasn't entirely detached from older communal values. Even later thinkers like John McMurray explicitly drew on Gaelic communalism to critique modern individualism.
So it's about shared cultural concepts, dialogue, filmtrod, practical wisdom, Fausact, belonging to dúchas, shaping the questions they asked and the assumptions they made.
Exactly. It's not that they were consciously writing Gaelic philosophy, but that this living cultural background formed part of the intellectual ecosystem they inhabited. It flavored their thinking.
Why is recognizing this important?
Because it complicates the idea of the Enlightenment as purely driven by abstract universal reason descending from Greece and Rome via Paris. It shows the Scottish Enlightenment had indigenous roots too. It values orality as a source of philosophical insight. It paints a picture of intellectual history as more hybridized, more locally grounded than we often assume. Scholars like Michael Newton and Cairns Craig are doing really important work uncovering these connections.
What a journey this deep dive has been. From questioning that straight line of European thought, looking at the Dark Ages differently, exploring anthropology's paradoxes, Machiavelli's misunderstood pragmatism, the practical side of the Enlightenment.
And it's incredible poetry, right up to finding these hidden Gaelic influences shaping thinkers we thought we knew.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other intellectual world hidden connections are out there, shaping the ideas we think of as just standard, universal?
Exactly. If the history of knowledge is this much more tangled, more global, more influenced by overlooked traditions than the standard story tells us, what does that mean for how we understand knowledge itself today? What insights are we still missing because we haven't looked closely enough at these less traveled paths?